people born wicked? Or do they have wickedness thrust upon them?
Or maybe they just want some of those Princess Peaches, if you know what I mean.
Oh god. Hi, I'm Magic Cyborg and I'm a nerd who makes stuff. One of my favorite subjects to talk about in the world of storytelling is the antagonist, also known as the villain. I think it's pretty obvious why stories often have villains. It's because they help assist the conflict, something that every story needs. They're either the cause of it, or they embody it. That's all well and good, but why do video games need villains? Well, you might want to brace yourself because the answer is pretty complicated. Make sure that you pay very close attention as you don't want to miss a single detail. Boss fights! Yeah, that's pretty much it really. The reason games have boss fights is to serve as a spike in challenge to the player, and to serve as a climax for a section of the game, or even the entire game itself if we're talking about the final boss. You know, it's quite common for book or film stories to only focus on one antagonist, as that makes things easier to write. But for video games, it's more common to have multiple villains. You want to know why? Because it means more boss fights. Oftentimes with game development, the gameplay has more priority over the story. That's not always the case, but most of the time it is. It's because of this way of thinking that the gameplay often influences the story. And nobody demonstrates this better than Nintendo. In Mario Sunshine, you use water to defeat enemies as well as platforming. And guess what? All that water comes from this talking robot. In Mario Odyssey, you use your hat to possess enemies as well as platforming. And guess what? Not only is the hat sentient, but he is after a similar thing as Mario. In Mario Wonder, you are able to wear badges that each has its own effect. And guess what? The badges are all worn by this little guy. Starting to see a pattern here? Nintendo has this cool habit of using characters that are used as the game's mechanics. And the same principle applies to villains. Boss fights and villains work hand in hand. So now that we know why villains exist in video games, it's now time to talk about what makes them good. Well, not good as in they, redeem themselves, but you know what I mean. Specifically, I want to talk about the main villain, the final boss. Now, this is where I would show footage of a final boss, but I don't want to spoil any games that you're wanting to play. So I guess it's time to make some illustrations. But of what though? Well, I did use footage from Wicked earlier. Screw it, we're making a Wicked Witch boss fight. I guess this video is just Wizard of Oz themed now. So what makes a good main villain is a pretty weird question to answer, as they don't have to be a 7-dimensional character to be considered good. And they don't need to be all big and grandiose either, even though the final boss is meant to be climatic. I'll talk more about that later. But regardless, to me the most important trait that all good video game villains have in common is that they are threatening. This sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised as to how often this gets screwed up. Let's say that our Wizard of Oz game we have here is some sort of comedic take on the story, and has some sort of reoccurring joke every time the Wicked Witch shows up, someone throws an egg at her. This may not seem like a bad thing at first, it feels pretty fitting for our lighthearted and comedic tone. Here's the thing though, remember when I said that the purpose of a boss fight is to give the player a spike in challenge? Well, that boss isn't going to feel satisfying to defeat if you're constantly making fun of them, is it? They'll just feel like a pushover. Players should have a sense of accomplishment every time they beat a boss, whether it's the first boss, final boss, or any of the ones in between. Now, I'm not saying that every villain has to be some brooding badass, nor am I saying that the player absolutely cannot laugh while the villain shares as much as a single pixel on the screen. It's okay to have comedic moments with your villain, even if it's directed towards them. It's also okay to have a charismatic or even a goofy villain, but don't let it compromise the villain as a threat. If you're going to have humor, use it to enhance a villain, not degrade it. Alright, so being a threat is the main thing that every bad guy needs. Now it's time for the more optional and intricate stuff. We've completed the adventure mode, now it's time for the side quests. Look guys, I said side quests, which is a video game reference, because this is a video about video games. Even though a lot of what I say here applies to movies and books as well. Gaming really changes your life, lol. Anyone else out here yelling plus 10 health when they finish dinner? Anyway, that's enough of that. Remember when I said earlier that final bosses don't have to be grandiose in order to be climatic? Allow me to elaborate. As I'm sure you can guess, what I mean by grandiose is the boss going all big and powerful. Pretty standard for most final bosses. Let's call these guys the big baddies. So common practice for big baddies is that the game will leave their details pretty vague and only reveal who the villain is until the very end to give the player a surprise. What's also common practice is to have a regular villain but they're related to the big baddie. Either they turn into it or they summon it, whatever works. However, it's also possible for the villain to not need a final form at all, and just have the final boss be, well, the villain itself. Now I know this isn't news to you, odds are you've played a game where this was the case. I know you're not stupid, you can always leave that part to me, I can guarantee it. But it does take a little bit of effort to get that kind of villain right. Allow me to explain. So the question is, how do we make a final battle against a gang leader feel just as epic as this mega chunker? One could argue that this is impossible, but we can get pretty dang close. The first thing we need is familiarity. We need to get to know the villain, who they are, and what they're planning to do. Perhaps it's not so much what they're planning to do, but maybe what they've already done, and it's up to us to reverse the damages. The player doesn't have to know all of this from the get-go. If you want a more mysterious opening, you can save all of the villain talk for later. The player should also be familiar with the world and its inhabitants, because the more the player gets attached to the world, the more the player will realize what's at stake. The second thing that a villain like this needs is resentment from the player. Now, knowing what the villain is planning, like what I discussed earlier, is plenty enough to build resentment. But we can go even further. You can show the villain doing deplorable things. Maybe the villain kills off a pre-established character. This is the key to making a climactic final boss without a big baddie, because the player is emotionally motivated after building all that resentment towards the villain. Now, none of this is to say that the big baddie can't be included. A villain can still build resentment and turn into a big baddie at the end, or a big baddie can build resentment itself. All of this works. What I'm trying to say here is that you can make a final boss climatic no matter what the scale is. Alright, before we leave things off, I want to talk about one more thing, and that is adding depth to a villain. If what I talked about before was considered side quests, then this would be the freaking button combinations that you would use to access a secret. If you want to add depth to a villain, the place to start would be a motivation, which basically means giving the villain a reason for being evil. It could be as simple as having some corrupted view of the world, or experiencing something that feels like an act of betrayal. But another way to give a villain a motivation is to give them a tragic backstory. Now, if I may give a piece of advice, I know I'm not exactly qualified and what I'm about to say is a bit influenced by my personal preference, but hear me out. If you're going to go with the tragic backstory route, then I would suggest that you leave a little bit of room for the villain to remain evil. In other words, don't go overkill with the tragic backstory, because, in my opinion, a villain's backstory should act as a motivation, not as an excuse. I'm not saying that everything has to be black and white. In fact, a tragic villain can work pretty well if done right. Remember what I said about how the player should feel accomplished after beating a boss? But what if they felt something else entirely? Perhaps questioning if they have done the right thing. That sounds like it would be pretty fun to play around with. However, that is the kind of storytelling that I would expect to see in something like The Last of Us, or even Fallout. You know, not even remotely close to a whimsical adventure like The Wizard of Oz. My point here is that a villain can have a motivation or even a tragic backstory without having the need for every single one of their actions justified. Your villain isn't any worse because of its absence. And I think that just goes to show how open-ended this whole subject really is. There really is no one size fits all, except for the threatening part. Make your villain threatening! But it's okay to not have a tragic backstory. It's okay to not have a motivation. It's okay to be all big and epic. It's okay to be scaled down and grounded. It's okay to have your villain not show up till the end. It's okay to have a goofy villain. It's okay to have multiple villains in a game. Hell, it's even okay for your villain to not be a boss fight. And let's not forget, it is okay to have a redemption arc. And that's all I have for this video. And speaking of redemption arcs, did I redeem myself from the mess that was the previous video? Or is there perhaps anything that you would like to add to this villainous discussion? Feel free to let me know down in the comments. One more thing. If you want me to talk more about storytelling in video games, I have made another video a while back talking about it. Although, the video is a little bit outdated for my liking. It doesn't exactly use my usual editing style, the mic quality is a little low, and there is no background music. I mean, this video wasn't even made with the intention of becoming a YouTube video. It was actually made for a high school project. Perhaps a remake is in order? Well, I don't know. That's kinda up to you to decide. Look at that, I gave you another thing to comment about. Okay, I won't keep you here any longer. Thank you so much for watching and have an amazing day.